And you see, you'll use the word inappropriate behavior, say. That'll be a kind of a global phrase that you will apply to this child as you're observing. His behavior is inappropriate. And that's what cues you that something's not quite right, perhaps. But once you have, in more detail, the concepts which the Anisa-Model provides, you'll be able to nail that down much more concretely. It will enable you to generate possible ways of going about this. Well, let me just say then that the theory of development had to identify the basic potentialities that we're concerned about. Now, since we've said all these potentialities are infinite in human beings, you couldn't list them. Because by definition, if it's infinite, there's no end. The only way you can deal with an infinite list of things is to place them in a finite number of categories. We looked at what the behavioral sciences, what folklore, what literature, what all these people said about the nature of man. We've made a list of all those capacities, abilities, and talents, achievements of human beings to see if they would fall into a number of categories. And we say they fall into 5. And these are the 5 basic categories of human potential. And when anything goes wrong in any one of them, or in more than one of them, then you will have probably a learning disability of some kind in one or more of these areas. Now, I want to back up just a minute to talk about the biological underpinning of these things, because the organism that is moving, that is seeing or hearing or thinking or feeling or willing, intending to do things, is biological. And therefore, we establish as a part of our theory a fundamental category of human potential, which we call biological potentiality. And the theory fixes nutrition as the key factor in its actualization. And you'll have a whole session dealing with this later on. But let me just give you some of the fundamentals now. When the sperm and the egg come together, they contain each half of a blueprint, which when put together contain the full blueprint, the genetic blueprint of the human being to emerge. This blueprint, contained in the thousands of genes that make up the chromosomes, 23 chromosomes from the mother and the 23 from the father, this blueprint organizes and has the instructional code for building that new creature in the womb of the mother. Now, the new human being is manufactured entirely out of what the mother eats. That's the only place it can come from. And even if it takes some of the substance from the mother's own body, the mother's own body is made up out of what she ate. Our bodies, let's say the biological potential that we represent as adults, was actualized through the things first our mothers ate and then the things that we ate. Now you can well imagine if the blueprint calls for a certain amount of vitamin A, say at the time the retina is formed, and the mother's not taking any vitamin A in, then what do you think the blueprint does? What do you think the foreman on the job does on the construction of this new human being? He said, well, we'll stop work until we get the vitamin A. No, they never hold up anything. It just goes right on, and they make do with what they got. And because of inadequate protein intake, 40% of the world's children are permanently, mentally, less well developed than they might be. And that's even getting worse in this country now, because even affluent families aren't doing very well because they're not eating the right kinds of foods. And it turns out now that many poor families who can only eat basic foods, like potatoes and so on, are doing better than other families who are eating so much refined junk. So in this model, the actualization of biological potentialities are foundational to the actualization of these psychological potentialities. So that the first thing you need to look at when you are diagnosing a child's problem is to see whether or not his nutritional status is up to par. We know, for instance, the child can't pay attention if he's got a vitamin A deficiency. We know that no formal learning takes place if the child cannot pay attention. Now, what do most teachers do when they see a child not paying attention? They say, "Johnny, sit up and pay attention." This is a singularly unilluminating piece of advice if you have a vitamin deficiency. Furthermore, teachers themselves may be in poor nutritional status, which will make them less patient, more prone to fatigue, more irritable, and therefore less open to the quality of the relationship which facilitates good teaching. So we're not, as a part of Project Inspire, going to require you to change your diet, but we will allow the pressure of nutritional knowledge which you will gain as a part of this to, you will have to deal with that pressure, that knowledge on your own. And if we see you looking slim and beautiful and filled with energy, then we'll be suspicious that you've changed your breakfast. We know that many children come to school, for instance, with the wrong kind of breakfast, and because of irregularities ultimately in sugar metabolism, it'd be difficult to pay attention. And some people now say that this irregularity in sugar metabolism, which is causing so much trouble, is now reached endemic proportions. 50 years ago, we ate quite a lot of sugar in this country, and Paul last night told me that the latest figure is that the average American consumes 160 pounds of sugar a year. Now you see, it turns out that the human brain, in order to work, requires glucose, pure glucose. It's sugar. Therefore, we were all born with a sweet tooth. Evolution has produced in us a sweet tooth, because the brain must have sugar. But what Mother Nature did not foresee, Mother Evolution, was the Great Western Sugar Company producing this stuff by the ton, and you could all get it in a little box in the grocery store. See, as we were evolving down through the millions of years, we needed that sugar. So we developed a taste for it. And in fact, this is where fruits came from, because we needed sugar. Because mammals and brains needed sugar, fruits appeared because, given the laws of evolution, the likelihood of the fruit surviving was greatly enhanced if there were people picking the fruit and taking it other places and spreading the seeds around. So the sweet thing that mammals needed was coated over the seed, so that the seed would be taken someplace else. And that increases the survival probability of those plants that have sweet-bearing fruits. And that's why you get the sweetness in the seeds all put together. And even birds that will eat seeds, a lot of the seeds have a shell which make it impossible to digest the seed. So when the bird excretes the seed, you not only have the seed, but you have a bit of fertilizer with it too. And that plant really maximizes the probability of its survival. Well, when you see how birds and bees and sex and sugar in evolution are all connected, it's quite a story. You wouldn't believe it, all this stuff that underlies sugar and glucose. The human brain, if it is a few seconds without glucose, will cause serious problems. You go into a coma, you see. And of course, we've now have this taste for it. In former times, it wasn't readily available. Now, it is too readily available, and we have to use our own willpower to resist taking so much stuff in. We're going to have a coffee break in a moment, and we'll go have some sugar. Now, it's time for that break right now. Just keep in mind that anything can go wrong in any one of these if that biological substructure is not in peak working order. And our first objective then in working with any child, and particularly those who are having learning problems and so on, is to make sure that they are in the best possible nutritional status. And this means ultimately what we feed them at school and what we teach them in school will have to reflect that, and we'll have to work with the parents. And when we come back, I'm going to take you through the psychological potentialities. I want to define teaching, I want to define curriculum, give you a little insight on what we think administration is and evaluation, and that will conclude our session for today. Thank you very much. Psychological potentialities, which we think any comprehensive school system of the future will have to be certain to actualize at reasonable rates if we're going to avoid massive pathologies in the years to come. In fact, the rapidity of social change as we head towards the year 2000 is creating massive stress on our society. And those who are not able to learn easily will not be able to cope. That's why we think a new kind of educational system for the future is going to have to be based on the achievement of learning competence. And it is the ability to develop competence in these 5 areas which will ensure general learning competence. The theory states that these potentialities are actualized through learning, just like those biological potentialities are actualized through good nutrition. That presupposes then that we have a clear idea of what learning is. Learning is one of many words which we educators use and which we don't really know the definition of. We have some generalized notion, but it's hard for us to say exactly what it is. We reviewed all of the basic learning theories, even the nasty ones like Hull and Skinner and Tolman and Thorndike, all the major learning theories, to see if we couldn't squeeze out a common denominator. The idea being that if we could understand what learning is clearly enough, we might be able to teach a child how to learn. And since learning is the means by which these potentialities are actualized, knowing how to learn would put the child in charge of actualizing his own potentialities. It would put him literally in charge of his own destiny, in this life anyway. And therefore, this became a very important thing for us to try to achieve. So I want to talk a little bit now about learning competence. When we squeeze these learning theories down to their common denominators, this abstract definition is what emerged. To learn means to be able to differentiate, integrate, and generalize experience. Now, let me just break those down, each one. Differentiation is the ability to break down experience, whether internal or external, into separate contrastable elements. I think these definitions will be in the literature which you will be given. Integration is the ability to combine these elements into a new whole. And generalization is the ability to transfer that whole to other situations, to apply it to other situations, so you have a transfer of knowledge. So the differentiation, integration, and generalization are the basic things which underlie all learning. It follows, therefore, that if a child is having learning disabilities, it is because he is not able to distinguish between two things which the particular learning task requires a distinction between, or he is unable to combine things, as say he doesn't see the relationships among them, or he is unable to generalize from one situation to another, something learned here. Or some combination of all three of those, or he may have mixed in with it some biological problem, perhaps related to diet or related to organic impairment of some nerves or organs, or some combination of all of that. Now, it is hard for us theoretically to see what else there could be that would cause a learning problem than those things. So once you go through each one, you ought to be able to pin it down, and on the basis of the rest of the theory, be able to make a prescription. Now, let me give you some examples of that in one of these areas. Take the psychomotor area. How does all of that apply to, say, psychomotor development? Because the curriculum that we have in this area is called the Curriculum for Developing Psychomotor Competence, or for learning how to learn in terms of the movement of your muscles. Essentially, psychomotor competence means the ability to differentiate all the movements of the muscles, the voluntary muscles. You know what muscles can move in what ways. To be able to integrate those movements into a variety of patterns to serve a purpose, any particular purpose, and then to be able to generalize pattern movements to other situations. Like you could go from, say, roller skating to ice skating, or you could go from jumping a rope to something else that's similar to it, to be able to generalize. The truth is that most of us have hundreds of muscles that we never use, or that we don't use very often, and that we don't have too much voluntary control over. And in fact, psychomotor development is largely carried forward unconsciously through maturation, until you want to do something that requires very fine motor movements, or movements requiring great strength, like in ballet, or in playing the violin or playing the piano. For instance, I don't suppose too many of you would be able to do that. Can you see that? Because most of you will not have had any exercise to lift the fourth finger up when the other two on either side are down. You won't be able to do it probably very easily. And I can tell it's a strain because your face is out. There are hundreds of movements like that. In fact, when I was in Germany, some friends of mine went to a yoga meister, because the thesis of this particular school of yoga was that if you could gain control over your muscles, you could then gain control over the mind. And once you gain control over the mind, you had control over your soul and destiny. Well, at least that was the thesis, and it sounded interesting. So I got a bunch of GIs together and we went. And this man could do the most extraordinary feats. And he had a little 5-year-old boy who could do the most marvelous things, and the eyes were clear, and the face was smooth, and the hair had a sheen, and they looked slim and lean and in the peak of health. And this one little boy, the son, put his body perpendicular to this pole. He took a hold of the pole and put his body out perpendicular to the pole, and then he just wound himself up clear to the top like a fan, with his feet out here just circulating around the pole, went clear up to the top and then came down. And we all tried. We couldn't even get perpendicular to the pole, let alone go up the pole. And he showed us all kinds of muscles that he could move, in the abdomen, for instance, and so on, that none of us could move. We just didn't feel there was any connection between the head and that muscle. You know, we didn't even know where to start to move it. See? And of course, when you get into playing the piano or the violin, you see, there's a lot of coordination, which must be preceded by differentiation of those muscles before you can get them into a pattern, you see. And for a child, before the child has taken a step, walking, which is a patterned use of energy, which is a potentiality to be expressed, when the child actually walks, you see that potentiality actualized in a patterned use of energy, which we call walking, putting one foot in front of the other and moving the body through space. All of these things can be broken down and understood in terms of differentiating, integrating, and generalizing. And a child may have a learning problem related to bad coordination in muscles because he's not seeing properly. Or he may be afraid, and therefore won't work with these two. Or he's muddled in the head for some reason. Or he's been so spoiled he has no volition left. We tend to mess up kids' volition these days, so they don't have any feeling of independent ability to make a decision and go do it. Now I want to just say one sentence or two about each of these so you have an idea of what they are, and then I'll move on. I've already talked about psychomotor development, and this is why I think there ought to be a movement and dance curriculum in all preschools and heavily emphasized in the early age levels. Because one of our propositions in our theory of development is that potentialities, the actualization of potential, is sustained by interaction with the environment. Now, the way a child interacts with the environment largely depends upon his psychomotor abilities. A child who handles his body well explores. One who handles his body poorly doesn't explore. And the one who explores a lot learns more. The one who is not afraid moves into new environments. And he will be less afraid if he's in control of his muscles and if he's poised. You know, the person who stumbles over everything and spills everything loses confidence. And everybody else loses confidence in him too. He doesn't get invited over to your house if you have a new rug or whatever. Perception has to do with the ability to take in information from the outside through the eyes, through the ears, through all the sense organs, and to integrate that information into an interpretive scheme on which action can be based. We know that some children see a little bit and they see it slowly. They can be trained to see a lot and see it more quickly. A child who can see a lot and see it more quickly has an advantage over a child who sees a little bit and sees that little bit slowly. So we can speed that up. The cognitive area has to do with thinking. Now, mankind has been thinking about the nature of thinking for 2,500 years at least. And we're still not all that sure of what it means. But we have picked out what we call patterns of thought, which taken together constitute cognitive competence. And we say a child who can think in all of these ways, taken collectively, would be a master thinker. And here's an old list. These are just words that refer to patterns of thought. And our learning how to think curriculum eventually will contain things such as this. And since, for instance, mathematical thought, which depends on a number of these, is a prerequisite to doing well in math, we have a means, I think, here of getting rid of all the pitfalls in learning math. It looks as if, well, let me just say what they are here. It looks as if all mathematical thought depends upon classification, on conservation, which is not here, on transitivity, and on seriation. Now, I'm not going to explain what all those are right now, but suffice it to say, if a child is just manipulating symbols and memorizing relationships, but he doesn't have the thought structures underlying an understanding of those relationships, he may, by rote memory, be able to manipulate the symbols for a certain amount of time. But after a while, that'll run out, and it won't work anymore. And we tend to get children manipulating symbols before they understand the thought processes that are required to comprehend relationships. For instance, just to give you a quick idea, when a teacher talks about a number, she never distinguishes between that number used ordinally or that number used cardinally, just to give you an example. Because we say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we mean it's in the 5th place, and we're not talking about quantity. So we're talking about ordination. In fact, if you have 5 pairs in a row, each pair is exactly the same size as every other pair. It's just that one of them happens to be in the 5th position. But we also use the same numbers to refer to amount or quantity. But most of us don't even understand what quantity is. Quantity is the abstract property of a group. And until a child understands that, he's going to have trouble manipulating quantities. That's why if you ask a child, you have 5 elephants and 5 peanuts, and you say to the child, which group has more in it? The child will always say that the elephant group has more elephants in it than the peanut group, even though you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there are 5 elephants, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, there are 5 peanuts. Which group has more in it? The child will say the elephants have more in it, because the child is percept bound, and those elephants take up more room on his retina than those peanuts. See, what relates the group of 5 elephants and makes it the same as the group of 5 peanuts? It is 5-ness. They are both groups which have 5 items in them. But that's an abstraction, and most children cannot deal with that abstraction. But until they can, they won't be able to understand the cardinal aspect of numbers. So we have a lot of experiences which we give children, which enable them to understand ordination and coordination long before or at the same time that they're beginning to manipulate the numbers. Affective development refers to the organization of the emotions. When a baby is born, he simply is able to react. And the reaction eventually differentiates into many different kinds of emotions. And then those have to be integrated if you're going to have a sensible, sane, emotional life. And the truth is, if your emotions are messed up, chances are your thinking may be too. And there has to be some coordination between the two. Putting together the affective development curriculum has been perhaps the most complicated of the entire model. It is just so difficult to get a handle on. And here's how it is now, and you'll later have a session on that. We see there are 2 basic classes of emotions. Those related to hope and those related to fear. And emotional development means, in essence, being able to get all of the hope-related emotions organized around all of those things you should do or need to do in order to support continuing growth and development. And you get all the fear-related emotions organized around those things that you should avoid doing because they are impairing the actualization of potential. Now the problem is, as we've grown up, we've gotten them mixed. We like doing lots of things that we shouldn't do, and we hate doing lots of things we ought to do. And the person who hates almost everything he should do and likes doing almost everything he shouldn't do is a person who's in trouble in our society or in any society. And the person who sails through is the one who just loves doing all those things they ought to do and who hates doing everything he shouldn't do. And those people are sometimes irritating, simply because they don't seem to ever stub their toe on anything, and they just are always sailing with great enthusiasm. And it's because somehow the way they were raised, they got those emotions organized, you see. Now, the way they get organized is largely through criticism, reward, and punishment. And those all arise out of qualities in the relationships among the people with whom they grow up. And really, if you've got your emotions organized properly, almost everything else is possible. But if that is messed up, so much of your energy will just go into kind of hanging in there and persevering. If a person is perpetually criticized, no matter what they do, and they've given practically no praise, you'll probably develop a competent person, but that person will have no confidence. And they're the sort of person you would like to play at the opening of the meeting, or you would like them to give a speech, and they never will. They're good, but they have no confidence. Then, if you do it the other way around, you just give indiscriminate praise and no constructive criticism at all. Then you develop a person who has massive confidence in everything, but is incompetent. And these people are a terrible pain, too. They're the one that always volunteer to do everything, and nobody wants them to do anything because they always make a mess of it. But they have, by the time they've reached adulthood, they're able to discount the subtle signs, you know, like nobody comes or whatever, you see. The trick is to get the balance so that the person has a level of confidence related to the level of competence. And that makes the best sort of person. Then if you ask somebody to sing, and they know they can't sing, they'll say, look, I have a terrible voice. But if you can't find anybody else who's better than I am, I'll give it a shot. But I'm just telling you, you won't like it. Well, you can live and work with a person like that because they've warned you that they sound terrible. And they also can say, look, I'm not going to do it because I know what a mess it would be. And even though you want me to, I'm going to spare you from your own poor judgment in inviting me. Now I want to just define for you teaching, curriculum, administration, and evaluation very quickly. If we say that the translation of potentiality into actuality is sustained by interaction with the environment, then teaching must be defined as arranging environments and guiding the child's interaction with those environments. Now you see, once you actually know that that's what teaching boils down to, you can begin to be very specific. That if the teaching isn't working, it's because the environment is deficient, as I say, it has not been arranged properly, or the child's interaction with that environment has not been guided in the right way. Now, if a child is having trouble differentiating, for instance, this will give you a cue, once you know that, to how the environment should be arranged and how the child's interaction should be guided. Or if the child is having trouble integrating, or if he's having trouble generalizing. So that you begin, as a teacher then, to be able to break this down. And you won't be able to do it sitting here right now. In fact, you probably wonder, how in the world can I? You would have a hard time thinking up a concrete example, quite likely. And some of the people who've been working with it for a number of years now find it second nature. But it takes a little while. But you'll begin to see all kinds of possibilities once you begin applying these ideas to the work that you're doing. And it's going to be our job and the other members of the staff to help you to be able to do that. So teaching then means arranging environments and guiding the interaction for the purpose of achieving the goals of the curriculum, which are all expressed in terms of actualizing human potential in some way, shape, or form. Now, all environments and all interactions are not equally powerful in actualizing a given potentiality. Knowing which is which differentiates a good teacher from a bad teacher. And I think good teachers intuitively know a lot of this, although they wouldn't be able to explain it. But that's the advantage of having a theory that raises to a level of conscious awareness what it is that's going on. Because then you have a hope of analyzing in more detail what's going on and modifying it when and if you need to. Now, let's look at curriculum. We said that the actualization of human potential is sustained by interaction with the environment. And we classify those potentialities. You now have to classify environments. And in fact, one thing to keep in mind, that there can be no theories and no science without classification and definition. So much of the clarification of this comprehensive system or approach to education arises out of clarity of definition on the one hand, and understanding how each one of those definitions relate to every other one. And seeing how, and that means how they are classed, how they are grouped. So you got categories grouped, you got potentialities classified, you're going to have environments classified, ultimately styles of guiding interaction will be classified, because if you don't have that, you won't be able to hold it all in your head, and you won't have a science. Whitehead broke the whole universe down into what he called levels of being, ontological levels. The Greek word ontology means a study of being. It's a fundamental branch of philosophy. So anybody talks about ontology, they're talking about a study of being. Or if they're talking about ontological levels in the universe, they're talking about levels of being. And he said the lowest fundamental level is comprised of mineral life, mineral existence. And when you add to that the possibility of reproduction and growth, you have a new level of creation, which he calls vegetable. And when you add to that the possibility of the senses and mobility, you have an animal level. And when you add consciousness, the ability to symbolize, and so on, you have another level. And then he said, beyond that, things are unknown to us. And he sometimes refers to that as deity. But I think the Whitehead's definition of God would not be terribly appealing to most people. And it's too complicated for me to explain now. But the point is, ultimately, it's unknowable. But he makes the point that if you want to understand something about the mineral level, you must speculate about this level. And to understand something about this level, you must understand something about this level. And therefore, to understand man, you must speculate about these unknowables. And the fact is that we are all heading into and deal with unknowns. Now, we took this scheme and broke it down into three basic categories. Which we call the physical environment, the human environment, and unknowns. And one part of our curriculum, which is called the content curriculum, refers to information about these environments, which we have to learn. The other part of the curriculum is called the process curriculum, and it concerns the development of these potentialities. So curriculum is, from our point of view then, this: two interrelated sets of objectives, one concerning content, which is information about the world in which we live, organized according to these ontological levels, and process, which are goals dealing with the actualization of the five categories of potentialities. So it is those two things, those interrelated sets of goals, plus what children actually do, usually with the help of a teacher or a parent, to achieve those goals. So curriculum is not just the book or the lesson plan. It is actually what the children do with the teacher in order to accomplish those objectives. You'll notice that in all of our definitions, they get always right down to a use of energy, because this is the fundamental reality in the universe on which everything else hinges. That's why our first principles are always pushed right down to the ultimate, and it always comes down to either matter or energy, which are alternative forms of the same reality, ultimately, if you can buy Einstein's thesis. So, here's the definition then. There are two interrelated sets of educational goals concerning content and process and what the children actually do. That's the interaction component. So when you're developing a curriculum, those are the things you would need to know before you had one, according to our thesis. See, if you know just the objective, but you don't know what the interaction should look like, for what environment the child should interact with in what ways in order to accomplish those objectives, the curriculum won't be very useful. Yeah, I mean, it won't be a full curriculum from our point of view. Now, of course, there's a tremendous number of different possibilities of interaction with an infinite number of environments, all of which could actualize the same potentiality or help the child memorize or learn something about the content. But, and that's why there is no way for us to teach you every one of those 20 million details. That's why once you understand the theory, you can fill in the details right on the spot. And that's what makes a teacher generative. Now, to get back to the content curriculum just for a moment, we found out that most traditional curricula are in fact organized along the lines of Whitehead's ontology. And so you get physics and chemistry dealing with mineral, you get botany dealing with the vegetable, you get zoology and ethology dealing with animals, and then all of these things dealing with human beings, and then you have philosophy, religion, and aesthetics dealing with unknowns. Now I want to say just a word about these unknowns, because one of the gifts of consciousness is that you know when you know, and you also know when you don't know. And in fact, curiously enough, when you've learned something, you can even remember that you once knew it and that it's now forgotten. You say, well, I used to know that, but I don't anymore. At least you can't retrieve it, you see. So our consciousness makes us very sensitive to unknowns. And in fact, the capacity to pursue an unknown is in part what is meant by faith and curiosity, which I define as an element of faith. And these two things are natural intrinsic motivators for children to learning. So if you destroy faith and curiosity, your school will be dead. And children will only learn if you threaten to beat them. And then that has its own problems, of course. And you get tired of beating them too. Now, man has developed three kinds of symbol systems to help understand these basic environments. For this, you have math. For this, the human, you have language. And for all the unknowns, you have art. In fact, we have developed an aesthetic theory which in essence says the function of art in a society is to paint visions of possibilities. Remember that possibilities are potentialities, and potentialities are not known in their specificity, and therefore they have to be approached on faith. There's no other way. Now, let me put it all together in one other way. This time talking about higher order competencies and the formation of values. As the human being interacts with a type of environment, he will get a type of value system that comes out of that. Let me define a value for you. When I ask you, what do you think a value is, you will probably say to me, well, it's something you think is worthwhile, as opposed to something that's not worthwhile, and that's what your values are. We define value, again, in terms of energy. We say a value is a relatively enduring, patterned expression of energy in the personality. And it comes about by learning, and it represents a fusion of those 5 categories of potentialities: psychomotor, perceptual, cognitive, affective, and volitional. Incidentally, I just now remembered I forgot to say something about volition, which has to do with the capacity to intend things and carry them through to a conclusion. They're largely a function of the prefrontal lobes. And many people have great volitional competence. They know how to persevere, and they know how to struggle, and so on. And other people have no volitional competence. They don't do anything. They don't initiate anything. They're very passive towards life. And all people have volitional capacities, but some don't learn it as well as others. And that's why we have it. It's very important in here for us to have volitional strength. Now, as a human being interacts with the physical environment, he will develop, I better put them just all down at once so I can give them to you, because I want to go across this way. I don't know if you can even see those, can you? I'll tell you what they are as I get to them. As a human being interacts with the physical environment, he will develop what you might call a set of material values, or you could say scientific values if you want to. As he interacts with other human beings, he develops social values. And as he interacts and contemplates unknowns, he develops religious values. Or if that offends you, you can say philosophical values. But the truth of the matter is, we all face death. We all don't know what's going to happen to us. We all kind of have a sense of our own difference and separation from the rest of the cosmos and all those billions of galaxies and what lies out there in the nature of the universe. And nobody can mature, in my opinion, as an adult without coming to grips with how he is related to the cosmos. And that usually raises religious issues in some way, shape, or form. Even the atheist has to deal with these unknowns and therefore has to approach them on faith, because there's no other way to do it. This is the type of symbol system that is used to mediate interaction with those environments. On these scientific or material values rests technological competence. That's the type of competence. When you interact with the human environment, you get social values. Language is used as a symbol system to help you mediate it, and you develop moral competence. And here, when you interact with the unknown, you develop what we are calling spiritual or philosophical competence. The type of curriculum that you get for each of these, one has to do with math and science, one has to do with human relations and language, one has to do with aesthetics and the arts. There is a type of social order that emerges out of that, which projects on the large sociological, anthropological level. Technological order, a moral order, and a religious order, and all societies have them. Well, the purpose of that is to give you a sense of how the whole thing hangs together. Let me just say one word about each of these value systems. Each one, if it is a well-organized value system, will be organized around an ideal. And this is why ideals are essential to education. Without them, there is no basis for organizing your values. Now, if you have contradictory or incompatible ideals all mixed in and they're not clarified, then you will find it difficult to make decisions in life, because you'll be torn in two different directions simultaneously on a given issue. And for instance, what we posit as say, the ideal for moral competence, we set forth justice as the basic ideal for that. Justice and love, if you like. Now, we're going to deal with some of these topics a little bit more on Wednesday. Ideals, Whitehead says, are like lures. And if you don't have them, you won't have any direction. Now, when you take a person's material values, and his social values, and his religious or philosophical values, and all of those competencies based on them, and you integrate them into a whole, what emerges is the functional and structural reality of personal identity. You are known primarily by the patterned uses of energies that people come to experience when they're with you as you interact with these three kinds of environments. This is what makes you predictable. And when you say, I know myself, it should mean that you know how you will use your energy in a given environment. You know, Socrates said, know thyself. And all the great religious leaders down through the ages have always said, know thyself. And great tomes have been written about what that means. Nobody has ever organized what that does mean. But your identity and your personality is, in essence, a combination of the patterns of energy use. That's why I said if you have a chip on your shoulder, there are certain behavior patterns that that phrase represents. You use your energy in a certain way. If you're a cheerful person, that's a certain pattern of using energy. If you're a silent person, it means you don't put too much energy into wiggling your tongue. If you're a very talkative person, it means you put a lot of energy into wiggling your tongue. But those are patterned uses of energy, and they are usually related to specific environments. Now, if you wiggle your tongue an awful lot, and no other people are around, it says something about your personality. You're probably in deep trouble if you're talking to yourself all that much. Now, this has given us a way, actually, to assess a person's personality in a very definitive way, and we can predict on the basis of it whether or not the person you're going to marry will fit with you, will complement you sufficiently to make it a success. So we have even ultimately not only a rehabilitation program for criminals and juvenile delinquents based on this, a program to prevent mental illness and a program of therapy, but we also have a marriage counseling, pre and post system based on this, because once you get the fundamental principle, you can use it in every direction. Because let's face it, therapy requires learning. If you are going to get well, you have to learn new ways of seeing, new ways of moving your muscles, new ways of thinking, new ways of feeling, and new ways of intending. Those are the 5 categories of potentialities. Therapy requires learning. Now, if you're a juvenile delinquent, you have to learn new ways of perceiving, new ways of thinking, new ways of feeling, new ways of intending, new ways of behaving. Rehabilitation depends upon learning new patterns. And if you're in a marriage situation that is unhappy and filled with conflict and so on, the parties, if they're going to solve that, must learn new ways of seeing, new ways of thinking, new ways of feeling, new ways of acting. It requires learning. The hardest thing when you're an adult is to learn a new pattern. New pattern of teaching, or a new pattern of relating to your spouse, or whatever. And children, of course, are coming up. They're a little bit more moldable, because they're changing all the time. But for us, once we have habits, they're very difficult to undo. But you can be sure of this: they require learning. And anybody who understands learning, and anybody who is a competent learner, will be able to change better than somebody who is an incompetent learner. That's why if we can begin to bring forth generations of competent learners, we will have people who can adjust to the situation that we find ourselves in the world. And we'll begin to move ahead in a way which will not only ensure our survival as a species on this planet, but will enable us perpetually to improve the quality of life, which are 2 main objectives, really, for our existence. There are other things too, but those are among them. Well, that concludes a kind of massive overview of this system and how it can be applied. And as you can see, it can be applied not only to education, but to anybody who is a human being who wants to improve what he's doing and have a more productive life and a more stable life, and one which has a freshness because of the ability to generate new perspectives, learn new things, and go on growing and developing. The important thing is your potentialities are actualized through learning. If there is no new learning, you won't have your potentialities actualized. And our thesis is that if you get children coming through a system where this is the main focus, you will have human beings that will go on growing and developing until the day they put their feet in the grave. And you probably have known such people who are in their 80s and 90s and are still discovering new things. I met such a woman when I was an undergraduate, and her name was Charlotte, and I've named my new daughter after Charlotte. Some of you don't know, I have a daughter who's 12 and one who's 15. They're both going on 13 and 16. And then my wife and I decided to start all over and do a baby, you might say, according to this system. And the Anisa model actually begins a year before conception, getting the mother and father in the best nutritional state. The mother goes on a special diet during the 9 months during gestation, and the curriculum for the baby begins on day 1. when the baby pops out of the womb. My wife said, no baby pops out of the womb. That's a male chauvinistic perspective, according to her. Anyway, we didn't have a son, so we decided we'd do two things at once. We'd have a baby and try out this new system, and we'd try for our son as well. Well, we got a third daughter, and we named her Charlotte after this marvelous woman who was in her 80s. She was 84, getting a degree in music and international affairs at the University of Wyoming when I was there as a music student. And she was just filled with energy and life, more so than the undergraduate. She wore bobby socks, and she attended late parties, and she rode a bicycle, and she was just learned everything. And when she was in her 90s, after I'd gone off to Oxford and had been in the Army and come back to the University of Chicago, I wrote her and said, come to Chicago, I'd like to see you. And she's 93. And I thought, well, when I went to pick her up at the plane, they'd be lowering her down in a basket. But they didn't. She came jumping down the stairs, and the first thing she said to me was, do, mi, so. She said, say that, the motor of that, the engine of that airplane vibrates in the key of F. And we started. It was just that way the whole time she was there. She just saw new connections among all facets of her life, and she was into this where learning was the most important thing for her in her life, and always had been. So she was madly curious about everything and just filled with energy. So unlike so many people that, that you may know. And curiously enough, when I was an undergraduate there, I often used to eat lunch with her. And she and I even went out on occasion. They used to say, look, you see Dan Jordan, he's dating this old woman who's 84. So one time when we were working in the cafeteria, he said, Dan, what is this between you and this old woman? I said, you know, this old woman has got more on the ball and is more interesting in conversation than any undergraduate I've met in this university. Because she was a woman interested in ideas and their application in life, and her interest in possibilities. And that's really what gives vitality and vibrance to life. And that's what ought to be at the heart of all educational systems. And teachers who have it communicate it to children, and children who get it then love it, and they will hang around forever, because that's where you have the intrinsic sense of utter well-being and excitement for life. And that's what keeps you going. When that dies, that spark of divine discontent goes, and you've gone to sleep. Even though you're walking around and consuming groceries, nonetheless, your life is over. Well, I've enjoyed very much being with you, and I'll enjoy seeing you on Wednesday. Thank you very much.